Dust choked the breathless Nebraska air as an auctioneer's gavel sealed a young woman's fate. Traded to a ruthless saloon boss for her dead father's gambling debts. She stood weeping on the block. Hope vanished until a scarred drifter stepped from the shadows, drew his Colt, and whispered the impossible. The wind howling off the Nebraska plains carried the stench of cattle, cheap whiskey, and desperation. It was September 1878 in Ogallala, a booming terminus for the great cattle trails, and a town where morality was easily bought with a handful of silver eagles. For 19-year-old Cora Higgins, this unforgiving frontier had just become the end of her world. She stood on a makeshift wooden platform outside the assayer's office, her wrists bound loosely in front of her with coarse hemp rope. The rough wood splintered against her worn leather boots. Below her, a sea of unwashed drovers, gamblers, and transient miners stared up with eyes that ranged from pitying to hungry. Cora's nightmare had not begun on this auction block. It had started 3 weeks prior, in the suffocating darkness of a tuberculosis ward, when her father, Josiah Higgins, finally succumbed to a violent coughing fit. Josiah had been a dreamer, a man who moved his only daughter from Ohio to the unforgiving West with promises of fertile land and a new beginning. Instead, the locusts took their first crop. The bank took their homestead, and the Golden Spur Saloon took Josiah's soul. In his grief and failure, Josiah had racked up a staggering debt at the faro tables, $2,000. It was a sum a working man couldn't earn in a decade. He owed it all to Bartholomew Cleary. Cleary was a man who owned more of Ogallala than the local government. He controlled the saloon, the brothel upstairs, the livery, and the very magistrate who now stood beside Cora, reading a corrupted legal document, Judge Harlan, a sweating, nervous man who drank Cleary's imported bourbon for free, cleared his throat. By order of the territorial court, Harlan bellowed over the wind, the estate of the late Josiah Higgins being wholly insufficient to satisfy his lawful debts. His surviving ward, Cora Higgins, is hereby remanded into a state of indentured servitude. The term of said servitude shall be dictated by the highest bidder, the proceeds going directly to the aggrieved party. Mr. Bartholomew Cleary. It was a thinly veiled auction of human flesh. The Emancipation Proclamation was the law of the land. But out here, in the shadow of the Black Hills and the sprawling, lawless territories, men like Cleary wrote their own laws. Indentured servitude was merely a polite term for a cage. Everyone in the crowd knew exactly where Cora would be working and what she would be forced to do to pay off $2,000 in a saloon. Tears, hot and blinding, spilled over Cora's eyelashes, carving clean lines through the prairie dust, coating her cheeks. She looked out at the faces of men her father had called friends. The blacksmith looked away, suddenly fascinated by the dirt on his boots. The baker, who had given her day-old bread just a week ago, retreated into his shop and pulled down the shade. Fear ruled Ogallala. No one crossed Bart Cleary. Cleary stood at the front of the crowd, chewing on the end of a long, unlit cigar. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored wool suit that looked entirely out of place amidst the canvas and denim of the townsfolk. His eyes, pale and devoid of warmth, locked onto Cora. He didn't look at her like a woman. He looked at her like a piece of prime livestock he had just successfully branded. "I'll open the bidding," Cleary said, his voice smooth and carrying easily over the restless murmurs of the crowd. $2,000, a fair price to settle the debt. And I reckon she'll be mighty useful up at the Golden Spur. A few of his hired thugs, standing near the saloon doors, chuckled darkly. The rest of the town remained in a heavy, suffocating silence. Harlan raised his wooden gavel. $2,000 bid by Mr. Cleary. Do I hear any other offers? Going once. Cora squeezed her eyes shut. She thought of the cold, muddy waters of the South Platte River just outside of town. If she could just slip the ropes. If she could just run. But she knew Cleary's men would run her down before she made it past the livery. She was trapped. Her father's weakness had forged her chains. Going twice. Judge Harlan droned, already raising the gavel for the final strike. Clink. The sound was sharp, metallic, and completely out of place. A heavy leather pouch landed squarely on the wooden planks of the platform, right at Judge Harlan's feet. It hit with a dense, muted thud, the sound of heavy coinage. A single, gleaming gold double eagle spilled from the loosened drawstrings, catching the midday sun. The crowd parted like water. A man stepped forward from the shadows of the general store's awning. He was tall, his broad shoulders cutting a solitary silhouette against the harsh Nebraska sunlight. He wore a dust-caked canvas duster, a low-pulled Stetson, and a pair of worn leather chaps. But it wasn't his attire that silenced the crowd. It was the heavy, bone-handled Colt .45 resting comfortably on his right hip, tied down low to his thigh, the mark of a man who drew fast and aimed true. "Debts paid," the stranger said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute stillness. "The girl walks." Bartholomew Cleary's smug expression vanished, replaced by a dark, dangerous flush. He spat his cigar into the dirt. "And who the hell are you, drifter? This is a legal proceeding, a private matter between me and the Higgins estate." The stranger didn't look at Cleary. Instead, his piercing blue eyes, cold and clear as a winter sky, found Cora. He stepped up onto the platform, up close. Cora could see the map of hard miles etched into the corners of his eyes, and a pale scar cutting across his jawline. "Name's Wyatt Mercer," he said calmly. A ripple of nervous murmurs swept through the drovers. Even in Ogallala, the name Wyatt Mercer carried weight. He was a former Texas Ranger out of Bexar County, a man who had survived the violent border skirmishes and had recently made a fortune striking a vein in the Dakotas. He was known for two things: a rigid, unbreakable moral code, and leaving a trail of bodies when that code was violated. Judge Harlan, trembling visibly, nudged the leather pouch with the toe of his boot. "Mr. Mercer, sir, there must be $3,000 in gold here." "Keep the change," Wyatt said, his gaze never leaving Cora. He reached into his duster and produced a bone-handled hunting knife. Cora flinched, but Wyatt's movements were deliberately slow and gentle. He slipped the blade between her wrists, slicing through the thick hemp rope in one fluid motion. The rope fell to the planks. Cora rubbed her raw wrists, staring up at him in utter disbelief. Why would a stranger trade a fortune for her life? Cleary stepped forward, his hand drifting toward the derringer he kept hidden in his vest. "Now you listen to me. Mercer, I don't care how fast you are or what they say about you down in Texas. That girl belongs to me. She's property of the Golden Spur until that paper says otherwise." Wyatt didn't turn around. He simply reached out, his leather-gloved hand gently cupping Cora's shoulder. The warmth of his grip anchored her against the sudden vertigo that threatened to drop her to her knees. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, shielding her from the stares of the crowd. "You're safe now," Wyatt whispered. The words weren't a boast, they were an ironclad vow. Then, Wyatt pivoted. His right hand hovered over the Colt. The casual demeanor evaporated, replaced by coiled, lethal tension. "The debt is paid in full. Cleary, the ledger is clean. If you or your dogs have an issue with my mathematics, we can settle it right here in the mud." The street held its breath. A tumbleweed skipped past the livery. Cleary's eyes darted left and right, assessing the odds. He had 3 men with him. Mercer was alone. But Mercer was looking at Cleary with the dead, calm eyes of a man who had already decided he was willing to die today. Cleary, for all his bluster, was a businessman, not a gunfighter. "Kill him!" Cleary hissed, stepping back behind his men. The ensuing violence was an explosion of sound and smoke. Cora screamed as Wyatt shoved her hard to the floorboards. In the same breath, Wyatt drew. The movement was a blur, too fast for the eye to track. Bang, bang. 2 deafening roars echoed off the wooden storefronts. Cleary's lead gunman, a scarred brute named Hackett, dropped his Winchester before he could level it, clutching a shattered collarbone. The second man fired wildly, his bullet splintering the post inches from Cora's head. Wyatt fired a 3rd time, dropping the second man with a bullet through the thigh. The 3rd thug, seeing his companions fall in a span of 3 seconds, threw his hands in the air and backed away slowly. Through the acrid cloud of black powder smoke, Wyatt stood perfectly still, his Colt still raised, the barrel smoking. He cocked the hammer back with a sharp click, aiming dead at the center of Cleary's chest. "I'm taking the girl," Wyatt said, his voice echoing in the sudden, ringing silence of the street. "If anyone follows us, I won't aim for the legs next time." He holstered his weapon smoothly, reached down, and hauled Cora to her feet. Before she could process the bodies bleeding in the dirt or the ringing in her ears, Wyatt was pulling her off the platform. They moved quickly toward the hitching post outside the livery, where a massive, midnight black gelding and a sturdy roan mare were tied. "Can you ride?" Wyatt asked brusquely, tossing her the reins of the roan. Yes," Cora stammered, her hands shaking violently as she grabbed the saddle horn and hauled herself up. "Then ride hard. Don't look back." They spurred their horses, tearing out of Ogallala as the town erupted into chaos behind them. They rode north, pushing the animals hard across the sprawling, sage-covered plains. The wind whipped Cora's hair, and for the first time in weeks, the air she breathed felt clean. It tasted like freedom. They rode until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Nebraska sky in violent streaks of purple and blood red. Only when the horses began to foam did Wyatt finally signal a halt. They made camp in a dry ravine, hidden beneath the shadow of a limestone overhang. Wyatt built a small, smokeless fire from dry scrub brush. He handed Cora a tin cup of water and a piece of hardtack. He hadn't said a word to her since they fled town. He just sat across the fire, cleaning his Colt with methodical precision. Cora stared at him over the rim of the tin cup. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a terrifying reality. She was alone in the wilderness with a killer. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice raspy from the dust and the crying. $3,000 in gold. You don't know me. Mr. Mercer. No man gives away a fortune out of the goodness of his heart. What do you want from me?" Wyatt paused, his thumb resting on the cylinder of his revolver. He looked up, the firelight casting harsh shadows across his scarred face. "I saw a man auctioning off a human being like a prized heifer. That didn't sit right with me. I don't want anything from you. Miss Higgins, tomorrow, I'll point you toward the rail station in Cheyenne. You can go wherever you please. Cora studied him. His eyes were sincere, but there was a deep, solitary sadness in them. She realized then that Wyatt Mercer wasn't rescuing her. He was seeking redemption for something else, some ghost from his past down in Bezar County. But as she looked at this dangerous, honorable man, Cora knew she couldn't just get on a train. She reached into the bodice of her tattered dress and withdrew a small, leather-bound notebook. It was heavy, packed with tight, cramped handwriting. "I can't go to Cheyenne," Cora said softly, "and Bart Cleary isn't going to let us just ride away." Wyatt frowned, slipping his gun into its holster. "Cleary is a coward. He won't track us out here." "He will," Cora replied, her voice trembling but resolute. She held the notebook out across the fire. "Because he wasn't buying me to settle my father's debt, Mr. Mercer. He was buying me to get this back." Wyatt took the book. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers and names, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then realization dawned, turning his expression to stone. "This is an accounting ledger," Wyatt murmured. "My father didn't just drink at the Golden Spur," Cora explained, her voice gaining strength. "He kept the books for Cleary to pay off his tab. Before he died, he gave this to me. It details every bribe Cleary has paid to the territorial governors, every federal judge he owns, and the exact payouts he made to the rustlers who hit the Union Pacific trains last spring." Wyatt stared at the book, the magnitude of what she was holding hitting him. "Miss Higgins, this book is a death warrant. It proves Cleary is orchestrating federal crimes. If a U.S. Marshal gets a hold of this, Cleary will hang." "I know," Cora said, lifting her chin. The terrified girl on the auction block was gone, replaced by a survivor forged in the harsh fires of the West. "He searched our boarding room. He searched my father's grave. He put me on that block to strip me of everything, to break me until I handed it over." Wyatt slowly closed the book. He looked at Cora with a newfound respect. She wasn't just a victim. She was the most dangerous woman in the Dakota Territory. "Well," Wyatt said, a grim, humorless smile touching the corner of his lips. "It looks like my $3,000 bought me a war. For 3 days, they rode through the punishing terrain of the Dakota Badlands, a labyrinth of sun-baked shale and twisted ravines. The landscape was beautiful but merciless, much like the man riding ahead of Cora. Wyatt Mercer rarely spoke, communicating instead through sharp hand signals and the tilt of his head. He rode with the agonizing vigilance of a hunted man, his eyes constantly scanning the jagged horizons. Cora, meanwhile, was learning the brutal realities of survival. Her hands, once soft from mending lace and baking bread, were blistered and calloused from the leather reins. The fine wool of her dress was torn, stained with alkaline dust and horse sweat. Yet, beneath the physical toll, a quiet strength was crystallizing within her. She was no longer the terrified girl weeping on a wooden block. She was the guardian of a ledger that could bring down an empire of corruption. On the 4th night, an unseasonal chill rolled down from the Black Hills, bringing with it a biting, sleet-filled rain. Wyatt directed them toward a shallow cave obscured by tangled scrub oak. As he unsaddled the horses, Cora struggled to start a fire with damp kindling. Wyatt crouched beside her, his large, calloused hands gently nudging hers aside. He struck a match against his boot heel, cupping the tiny flame against the wind until the dry moss caught. The firelight flickered, illuminating the deep, jagged scar running along his jaw. "You're shivering," he noted, his gravelly voice softer than usual. He unfastened his heavy canvas duster and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The coat smelled of leather, gun oil, and rain, a scent that made Cora feel inexplicably safe. "Thank you," she murmured, pulling the coat tight. She watched him as he checked the cylinder of his Colt for the third time that evening. "You never sleep." "Do you?" Wyatt didn't look up from his weapon. "Sleep out here is a luxury we can't afford. Miss Higgins, Bartholomew Cleary isn't a man to let a bruised ego and a stolen ledger go unanswered. He'll have sent Deacon Miller after us." "Deacon Miller? A tracker. Used to hunt Apache down in the Arizona territory before he realized hunting white men paid better," Wyatt explained, sliding the Colt back into its holster. "He's half bloodhound, half rattlesnake. If he's on our trail, we won't hear him until the bullet hits." Cora swallowed hard, the reality of their situation pressing in on her. "Wyatt, why did you really step onto that auction block?" "You told me you didn't want anything from me, but a man doesn't risk the hangman's noose or a tracker's bullet just because he doesn't like auctions." Wyatt stared into the flames for a long time. The wind howled outside the cave, a lonely, desolate sound. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight, carrying the weight of a decade of grief. 10 years ago, in Bexar County, Texas," Wyatt began, his eyes reflecting the fire's orange glow. "I was a ranger, young, proud, thought a tin badge made me invincible. I spent weeks tracking a band of Comancheros who were raiding homesteads. I left my wife, Abigail, at our cabin, told her I'd be back before Sunday." He paused, a muscle feathering in his jaw. Cora held her breath, intuitively sensing the sacred, shattered ground she was treading on. "I was delayed. A storm washed out the Brazos River," he continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "When I finally rode up to our property, the smoke was still rising. The Comancheros had circled back. They didn't just kill her. Cora. They took their time. I found her in the dirt, just like I found you on that stage. And just like you. She had been crying." A tear slipped down Cora's cheek. She reached out, her hand tentatively resting over his. He didn't pull away. "I spent the next 5 years hunting down every man who rode with that gang," Wyatt said, his gaze finally meeting hers. "I killed them all, but it didn't bring her back. It didn't wash the blood off my hands. When I saw you up there, terrified, surrounded by men who viewed you as nothing more than meat to be bought and sold, I couldn't ride past. For a second, I saw Abigail. I couldn't be too late again." "You weren't," Cora said softly, her fingers lacing through his. "You saved me." "Wyatt." "We aren't saved yet," he murmured. But the tension in his shoulders eased slightly beneath her touch. For the first time since they fled Ogallala, the space between them wasn't filled with the desperate need to survive, but with a profound, unspoken understanding. The next morning, they broke camp before dawn. By midday, the jagged peaks of Iron Ridge loomed ahead. Wyatt seemed to relax fractionally. "There's a cabin near the summit," Wyatt said, pointing toward a thin wisp of smoke curling against the grey sky. "Belongs to an old prospector, Jebediah Jeb Stone. He rode with me in Texas. He's a good man. We can resupply there, rest the horses, and then make a hard push for Fort Laramie. U.S. Deputy Marshal Heck Thomas is stationed there this month. If we hand him that ledger, Cleary is finished. They reached the cabin by late afternoon. It was a sturdy log structure built against a sheer rock face, highly defensible and well-stocked. Jeb Stone, a barrel-chested man with a thick grey beard and a missing left ear, greeted Wyatt with a bone-crushing embrace. "Wyatt Mercer, you stubborn son of a gun!" Jeb bellowed, ushering them inside out of the wind. "I heard you struck silver in Deadwood and retired to a life of silk sheets and French brandy. Rumors of my wealth are greatly exaggerated." "Jeb," Wyatt said, though a rare, genuine smile touched his lips. He introduced Cora simply as a friend, needing safe passage. Jeb provided them with hot stew, fresh coffee, and a safe place to sleep. For the first time in a week, Cora slept on a real mattress, wrapped in thick wool blankets. But out in the wild, comfort is often the prelude to catastrophe. Cora woke in the dead of night. The cabin was pitch black, save for the dying embers in the hearth. A strange, metallic clicking sound had pulled her from sleep. She lay perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly, she turned her head. In the dim red glow of the coals, she saw Jeb Stone. He was standing over Wyatt's bedroll. In his hands were Wyatt's gun belt and his Winchester rifle. Jeb was carefully checking the chamber of the rifle, making sure it was empty, before quietly setting it aside. Cora's blood ran cold. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the cabin creaked open. The freezing night wind swept in, bringing with it 3 shadowy figures. The lead man stepped into the light of the embers. He wore a dark duster and a wide-brimmed hat, his face obscured by a thick, unkempt beard. "Is it done?" "Jeb," the man hissed in a raspy, gravel-filled voice. "Guns are clear. Deacon," Jeb whispered back, his voice trembling slightly. "He's asleep. Where's my money? Cleary pays when the Mercer boy is dead, and I have the book." Deacon Miller sneered. He drew a long, vicious-looking Bowie knife from his belt and stepped toward Wyatt's sleeping form. It was a betrayal of the highest order. The safe haven was a slaughterhouse. Cora didn't think she moved. Instinct took over as she lunged from the bed, fingers tightening around the iron poker by the hearth. With a desperate cry, she swung. The rod cracked hard into the back of Deacon Miller's knees, dropping him instantly. He collapsed forward with a howl, his Bowie knife plunging into Wyatt's bedroll mere inches from where Wyatt's chest had been. Wyatt was already moving. Years of survival had sharpened his reflexes beyond hesitation. He rolled clear, drove his elbow upward, and smashed it into Deacon's jaw with brutal precision. Bone cracked. The cabin erupted into chaos. "Cora, get down!" Gunfire exploded in the cramped space as the other men drew their revolvers. Muzzle flashes lit the room in violent bursts. Cora dove behind the stove as bullets tore through wood and glass, splinters raining around her. Across the room, Wyatt slammed into Jeb, sending both men crashing through the table. The betrayal hit harder than any blow. But Wyatt didn't falter. He wrenched Jeb's knife free and struck him unconscious. "Cora, the book." "I have it," she shouted, hands shaking as she reached for cartridges. Fear clawed at her, but anger steadied her. She loaded the revolver with trembling fingers, forcing herself to focus. Outside, hooves thundered. More men were coming. Deacon, bleeding and broken, dragged himself toward the door, whistling sharply. "Cleary's here," he spat. "You're dead," Wyatt answered with a single shot, pinning him to the floor. Then he turned to Cora, urgency burning in his eyes. We can't hold this place. I'll draw them off. You ride, Fort Laramie, find Heck Thomas. No. She grabbed him, refusing. I'm not leaving you. This isn't about your father anymore, Wyatt said, softer now, but unyielding. It's about you surviving. Before she could argue, Cleary's voice rang out from the darkness, promising false mercy. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He stepped outside, firing into the night, drawing every gun toward him. The world became thunder. Cora slipped out the back, heart pounding, moving through snow toward the stables. But then silence. Sudden. Wrong. She turned. Wyatt was down. Cleary advanced, revolver raised, victory twisting his face. Where is she gone? Wyatt growled. Then you're useless. No, Cora stepped from the shadows, gun raised. Her hands no longer trembled. You don't have the stomach, Cleary mocked. You're right, she said, voice cold. Not for men, for monsters. She fired. The shot shattered his shoulder, sending him crashing into the snow. His men froze. Then a new command thundered across the ridge. Drop your weapons. Marshal, Heck Thomas and his deputies arrived like judgment itself. Guns fell. It was over. Cora dropped her weapon and ran to Wyatt, pressing against his wound as tears finally broke free. You didn't run, he whispered. I told you, she said. I'm not leaving. Later, with the ledger in hand, justice came swiftly. Cleary fell, and months after, in the quiet hills of Colorado, something new took root. Not vengeance, a life. If you felt the dust, the danger, and the desperate romance of the Wild West in Cora and Wyatt's story, don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button. Share this gripping tale with your fellow history and romance lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life-inspired audio stories. Your support keeps the campfire burning and the stories coming. Ride with us into the next adventure.